There are names that are merely words and others that are prophecies. His, Rolihlahla, was born from the whisper of the Mbasha River and the scent of damp earth from Transkei. On the 18th of July in the year 1918, in the village of Mvezo, his mother, Nosekeni Fani, bestowed upon the world a name that was both a warning and a destiny. In the Xhosa language, it means the one who pulls at the branch of a tree, the one who stirs things up, the troublemaker, a future sealed in the first syllable. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniswa, was a chief of the Madiba clan, a man of royal Thembu lineage, an advisor to kings. But the ancient power of the clans was no longer the only one in the land. A white magistrate, with the pen as his sword, stripped his father of his title and lands over a dispute of principles, a refusal to submit to an authority he did not recognize as his own. It was the first silent lesson about the nature of the new power, a shadow cast over the child's life. The dispossessed family moved to Kunu, a handful of mud huts scattered in a valley. In Kunu, the world of his childhood was a perfect circle. The kraal where the cattle slept, the round huts that sheltered him from the wind, the horizon that embraced the fields. Life was measured in the arc of the sun. In the mornings, the cold of the packed earth under his bare feet as he guided the calves to graze. The day was a canvas of simple games, battles with sticks by the stream, sliding down smooth rocks, molding clay oxen under the patient gaze of the African sky. There were no clocks, only the cycles of planting and harvesting, rain and drought. It was an elemental existence, woven with the threads of community, where every child was a child of all and every home, a refuge. But the sun of childhood has a sunset. When Rolihlahla was 9 years old, his father died. The death of a father is the end of a world, and for the child, it was the first crack in the perfect order of things. His mother, fulfilling her husband's last wish, took him to the great place, the royal palace of Mkekezweni, to place him under. The echo of the voices of Kunu slowly faded, like the light of sunset over the hills. The world of childhood, woven with the warmth of community and the ancestral rhythm of the land, was left behind, transformed into memory. For the young Rolihlahla, the path that lay ahead was no longer of familiar red earth, but one paved with the intention of an education that promised a place in a new order. The regent Yongintaba, guardian of his lineage, had decided that the boy's future was not in the tribal council, but in the classrooms of white men. His first destination was Clarkbury, a Methodist boarding school. There, the air smelled of chalk and polished wood, not of home smoke and livestock. The metallic clang of a bell, and not the crowing of a rooster, marked the rhythm of the days. It was a world of rules, of straight lines and fixed schedules. It was in that place of English discipline where a teacher, unable to pronounce his Xhosa name, gave him a new one. Nelson, a name that sounded strange in his own ears, a first borrowed garment that over time would adhere to his skin. He learned the history of English kings and the outlines of an empire on which the sun never set, while the history of his own ancestors became a whisper. There was no rebellion in him, not yet, only a deep curiosity and an exceptional ability to observe, to absorb the visible and invisible currents that defined that world. After Clarkbury came Healdtown, another Methodist institution, larger and more prestigious. There, the young Mandela began to feel the weight and shape of the society around him. He saw how education, presented as a ladder, had rungs of different heights depending on skin color. It was a silent truth, inscribed not in books, but in glances, in gestures, in the very geography of power. And yet, it was also there that he began to glimpse that knowledge could be something more than a tool for survival. It could be a weapon. The culmination of this first stage was the University of Fort Hare, a beacon of higher education for black people in southern Africa. Fort Hare was not just a university, it was a melting pot. Within its stone walls, the future intellectual and political elite of the entire continent gathered. The air vibrated with an intellectual tension that Mandela had never experienced before. They were the path that took him away from the university in 1941 was not a road of glory, but a silent escape. Behind him lay the academic murmur of Fort Hare, the weight of a royal heritage, and the shadow of an arranged marriage that his spirit could not accept. Ahead stretched the promise and the wound of Johannesburg, the city of gold. Egoli, a name that sounded like precious metal on the lips, but tasted like dust and sweat in the souls of those who built it. There are cities that are not discovered, but confronted. And Johannesburg, for a young black man in those years, was one of them. It was not the official capital, but the throbbing and feverish heart of the nation. A heart of gold that beat with the pulse of greed and fed on the strength, extracted from the bowels of the earth and from men. The young Nelson arrived not as a conqueror, but as a drop of water lost in a bitter ocean. The echo of his Xhosa lineage, so clear and resonant in the hills of his childhood, here drowned in the anonymous roar of the mines and the screech of the trams that traced the invisible but impassable borders of segregation. The air itself seemed different, laden with the smoke of chimneys and a tension that clung to the skin like a fine layer of soot. Here, the sunlight did not fall with the same grace on everyone. It illuminated the white suburbs in splendor, their manicured gardens and silences of privilege, but became elusive and grey in the labyrinths of the townships, where life was crammed into a choreography of survival. For Mandela, the contrast was a dull and constant blow. At the university, he had studied injustice as an abstract concept. Here, he breathed it in at every corner. He felt it in the evasive gaze of the whites, in the hunched posture of the workers, in the daily humiliation of the passbook, that document that turned a man into a legal ghost, bound to a permit to exist. His first job was as a night watchman in a mining complex. The cold of the night in the Highveld seeped into his bones, a cold that was more than the absence of warmth. It was the loneliness of the sentinel, watching a system that devoured everything. He saw men descend into darkness every morning and emerge at dusk, covered in dust that was the ash of their own dreams. They were shadows moving to the rhythm of a distant bell, and in their tired eyes, Mandela, the young man who had left the fields of Kunu, was no longer the same. Johannesburg had changed him, just as fire changes ore. The city, with its breath of coal and its feverish pulse, had shown him the bare face of power. The golden and bitter dust that covered its streets did not only come from the mines, it was also the ash of countless lives consumed by a system designed to break them. It was 1944. In Europe, the world was ablaze in a war for freedom, a distant and paradoxical echo in a land where freedom was an empty word for the majority. In this landscape of contrasts, In this open wound that was South Africa, there existed for a long time a venerable institution, the African National Congress. Founded in 1912, the African National Congress was like an old oak tree with deep roots, but whose growth had become slow, almost imperceptible. It was a lineage of educated men, of clergy and tribal chiefs, who believed in the power of the written word, in the strength of respectful petition. Their methods were those of memorandums, delegations, and appeals to a crown and a parliament that rarely listened. For many, it was an honourable echo of the past, a formality almost ritualistic in an increasingly brutal present. For Nelson Mandela, that young budding lawyer whose heritage still resonated with the pride of the Thembu, the African National Congress was the only visible river in a desert of oppression. But its current was too gentle, its course too predictable. He and others of his generation felt in their bones a distinct tremor, an impatience that would not settle for waiting. They saw how the laws of apartheid, one by one, were being etched into the stone of everyday life, encircling their futures, suffocating their dignity. The patience of their elders seemed to them a slow form of surrender. It was amid this tense stillness, in the nighttime conversations in the boarding houses of Alexandra, or in the hallways of the university, where a new energy began to take shape. It was not an explosion, but a confluence. Like tributaries meeting to form a torrent, the minds of Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and the brilliant and passionate Anton Lembede joined with Mandela's. They were a brotherhood forged in urgency, a constellation of futures that refused to be extinguished. They saw in the old African National Congress a venerable body, but felt it lacked a soul of fire. And so, in that same year of 1944, they decided to give it one. They founded the Youth. The fire of youth, which had burned in the halls of the university and in the nighttime debates of the Youth League, now had to find its channel. The theory, sharp as a spear, longed to touch the hard skin of reality. For the laws of apartheid were not an abstraction. They were the everyday geography of pain, an architecture of humiliation built with signs, fences, and looks of disdain. The winter of 1952 arrived in South Africa like a stone-cold truth. The air was cold, and the political landscape even colder. The government of the National Party had woven a web of laws that separated not only bodies, but also destinies. Invisible lines, yet as hard as granite, divided parks, trains, post offices, and the very sidewalks on which the living walked. In this fractured world, a young man, Nelson Mandela, felt that the time for words must give way to the time for actions. He was no longer just the young man of royal lineage who had left the fields of Kunu. Now he was a lawyer, a father, and upon his back began to settle the weight of a people. Alongside other leaders of the African National Congress, a plan was conceived. It would not be a rebellion of fire and steel, but one of silence and presence. The campaign of challenge. Its logic was as simple as it was profound. If a law is unjust, the duty of a citizen is to disobey it. They were inspired by the quiet and persistent tide of Gandhi, a force that does not break the rock but wears it down, surrounds it, submerges it. Mandela was appointed chief volunteer, a title that conferred no power but immense responsibility. He was the first in line, the face of a peaceful resistance. And so it began, not with the roar of a cannon, but with the almost imperceptible sound of footsteps crossing a forbidden threshold. Groups of volunteers, ordinary men and women, whose names would not be etched in the stone of monuments, but whose actions formed the foundation of a new era. They entered through the doors reserved for whites only. They sat on benches where their skin was a crime. They used the services that were denied to them. There were no shouts, no violence, only a solemn calm, a dignity that was in itself a weapon. Imagine the scene. A small group approaches the Boksburg train station. The afternoon sun filters through the dust, casting long shadows. They walk with their heads held high toward the waiting room for whites. The air tenses. Conversations cease. All eyes are fixed on them. There is no challenge in their eyes, only serene determination. After the thunder of the challenge campaign, an expectant silence had settled over the land. The dust of the marches was settling, and in the air lingered the question, not about how to resist, but about why to live. Civil disobedience had shown the moral strength of a people, but it had also revealed the impenetrable hardness of power, a rock against which the waves of protest crashed time and again. The apartheid government had not yielded. On the contrary, it had responded with a winter of even colder and more oppressive laws. Something more than the courage of the moment was needed. A map for the future was required, a song that everyone could sing in the long night ahead. Mandela, whose voice had already deepened in the councils of the African National Congress, understood, alongside the old pillars like Albert Luthuli and Walter Sisulu, that the struggle could not be sustained solely by denial. It needed a yes, a horizon. Thus was born the boldest idea yet, not to demand reforms, not to plead for amendments, but to draw, with the ink of the dreams of ordinary people, the outline of a new nation. The idea of the Congress of the People was born. For months, thousands of volunteers, anonymous and brave, spread across the vast and wounded South African landscape. They traversed the red dirt roads of the Transkei, descended into the mines where the air was thick and metallic, entered the kitchens of white suburbs and the shacks of the townships. They carried no weapons but notebooks. They asked for no obedience but yearnings. What would the South Africa you wish to live in look like? They asked. And the people, with the shyness of those who have never been heard, began to speak. Their demands, written on scraps of paper in the margins of old newspapers, were seeds of freedom. Let there be homes, security, and comfort. Let the land be shared among those who work it. Let all doors of culture and knowledge be opened. These thousands of voices, these whispers gathered from the heart of the country, were the clay with which the Freedom Charter was molded. It was not a text born in the office of a scholar, but an echo woven with the hopes of the miner, the teacher, the farmer, and the office worker. And then, in June of 1955, under a pale and vast, that echo from Kliptown had not extinguished. The words of the Freedom Charter, read under the open sun of a field, still resonated in the townships and in the hearts of those who dreamed of a South Africa that belonged to all. They were words of light, a promise sown in the cracked earth of apartheid. But every tide of hope provokes a backlash of fear on the shores of power. And power, feeling the tremor beneath its foundations, responded not with dialogue, but with the cold grammar of the state, the law as a weapon, the accusation as a lock. The winter of 1956 arrived with the dry sound of iron against wood. In the frozen fog of the early mornings, Before the first bird sang, the security police knocked on the doors of hundreds of homes. They were not looking for common criminals. They were searching for the poets of the new nation, the architects of the Charter. 156 souls, a mosaic of the South Africa they longed for, black, white, Indian, mixed, were torn from their beds, from their families. Among them, with the grave calm that was already beginning to define him, was Nelson Mandela. The accusation was the heaviest of all, an ancient and terrible word, high treason. The penalty, death. Thus began the treason trial. It was not held in a marble and solemn courthouse, but in the old drill hall of Johannesburg, a cavernous military hangar whose acoustics echoed every word like a ghostly echo. There, on an improvised and gigantic bench, sat that human forest. Teachers, workers, clergy, lawyers. Walter Sisulu, with his fatherly wisdom. Ahmed Kathrada, young and fervent. Lillian Ngoyi, whose voice was thunder. And Mandela, the lawyer, observing the machinery from within, understanding every gear of the system that now sought to crush him. The trial became a long and slow winter that would last more than 4 years. It was a theatre of the absurd. The prosecution, with mountains of confiscated documents, pamphlets, meeting minutes, the very Freedom Charter itself, tried to weave a narrative of violent conspiracy, of a communist plot to overthrow the state. They attempted to demonstrate that the yearning for a vote, that the demand to share the land, that the dream of their children not being judged by the colour of their skin was synonymous with sedition. For Mandela and his companions, the trial was a strange university, an open-air prison. During the day, they listened to the arid legal arguments. The dissection of their hopes turned into evidence. The verdict of innocence in the treason trial did not bring the relief of the sun after the storm, but rather the icy calm that precedes a longer winter. The state, acquitted of its charges, but not of its intentions, did not retreat. On the contrary, it entrenched itself behind higher walls of laws and barbed wire. For the African National Congress and for Nelson Mandela, the path of patience, that road travelled for half a century with open hands, seemed to fade into an abyss. Non-violence, like a mantra repeated before a stone wall, began to sound hollow, like a prayer without a God to listen. The breaking point had come a year earlier, on a day in March of 1960, in Sharpeville. The echo of police gunfire against an unarmed crowd still reverberated in the valleys and in memory. 69 lives cut short, their fallen bodies on the dust like leaves in a cruel autumn. That sound was not only of bullets, it was the sound of a door closing forever. In response, the government declared a state of emergency and banned the African National Congress. Peaceful protest became, by decree, a crime. Dialogue had extinguished, leaving only the monologue of power. For a man like Mandela, a lawyer trained in logic and persuasion, a disciple of Gandhian resistance, this was the longest and darkest of the nights of the soul. How does one abandon a principle that has been the pillar of one's life? How does one take up a weapon when one has defended words as the only worthy tool? It was not a decision made in the heat of anger, but in the cold silence of impotence. It is said that in secret meetings his voice, usually firm, was burdened with the weight of monumental doubt. He contemplated the faces of his comrades, the weariness in their eyes, the lineage of suffering they represented, and understood that peace had spoken for 50 years and had only received in response the thunder of weapons. Non-violence, he concluded with infinite sadness, is not a unilateral policy. And so, in secrecy, in dimly lit rooms, where the smoke of tobacco sketched uncertain plans, a new strategy was born. A name was born, first whispered in the shadows, then affirmed with the solemnity of a sacred oath. Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. The very name was an echo of the warriors of the Xhosa lineage, a connection to a past where the defense of land and people was not a matter of debate, but a duty. Mandela, alongside Joe Slovo and other leaders, became its commander. The decision to take up arms had been like throwing a stone into a still lake. The ripples spread in ever-widening circles, altering the landscape forever. Nelson Mandela, the lawyer, the organizer, was now a shadow, a whisper in the townships, the black rogue moving among the dust of the roads and the twilight of the cities. For 17 months, his life was a tapestry of false identities and clandestine hideouts, an echo that the apartheid regime pursued with a cold and methodical fury. On the 5th of August 1962, the sun of Natal beat down on a lonely road near Howick. The air smelled of dry grass and an inevitable end. A car was stopped at a routine checkpoint, or so it seemed. Inside, a man who called himself David Motsamai, a driver, felt time come to a standstill. Freedom, which had been a vast and dangerous ocean, suddenly shrank to the size of a cell. It is said that a distant shadow, that of the Cold War and its intelligence agencies, whispered his location to the South African authorities. But in that moment, only the hand on the shoulder mattered, the calm question, the recognition in the eyes of the officer. The black rogue had been caught. The echo at last had a body. His first trial was for incitement and for leaving the country illegally. But that was only the prelude, the wind that precedes the storm. While he served his sentence, the real blow fell. In July 1963, the police raided a farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg. Liliesleaf Farm was the hidden heart of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the nerve center of armed resistance. There, among chickens and tractors, sabotage was being planned. With the raid, almost all the high command was captured. The seized documents were the evidence that the state longed for, and Mandela's name was woven into each of them. He was taken from his cell and brought to the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, an irony of stone and marble. He and his companions were no longer accused of incitement, but of sabotage, a crime that in the South Africa of that time was punished by hanging. The Rivonia trial was not a legal process. It was a political theatre whose ending seemed written in blood. The prosecutor, Percy Utah, built his case with glacial precision, presenting the accused not as freedom fighters, but as communist terrorists willing to plunge the country into chaos. In the dock, Mandela made a decision that would resonate. The echo of the judge's gavel had not yet faded when Nelson Mandela's world shrank to the dimensions of a cell. The journey to Robben Island was not a mere transfer. It was a descent into another realm, an archipelago of forgetfulness anchored just a few kilometers from the coast, yet a universe away from life. The island was a wind-swept rock, shrouded in the cold mist of the Atlantic, a place whose name whispered stories of lepers, of exiles, of men whom history had chosen to erase. There, the man who had been a lawyer, speaker, and commander was stripped of his name. He became a number, 466-64, the fourth prisoner to arrive in the year 1964, a code etched into the coarse fabric of his uniform, a figure meant to supplant an identity. His cell was a concrete coffin, barely 2 meters by 2 meters, with a mat on the floor for sleeping and a bucket for his needs. The only window, barred, did not overlook the sea or the distant silhouette of Table Mountain, but rather the grey courtyard of the prison. It was a horizon of stone. The routine was a ritual of slow annihilation. Each dawn brought with it the icy wind from the Atlantic and the journey to the lime quarry. There, under an unrelenting sun, the political prisoners spent their days. The work was brutal, primitive. With picks and shovels, they broke the white stone, a futile effort designed not to build anything, but to shatter bodies and spirits. The lime dust, fine and corrosive, filled their lungs, and over time, the blinding reflection of the sun on the stone permanently damaged Mandela's eyesight. The sound that defined their days was the rhythmic, metallic clanging of iron against rock, a metronome of time suspended. But in the monotony of punishment, a silent resistance flourished. The regime had gathered on that piece of land the brightest minds and the most indomitable spirits of the struggle. Men like Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Ahmed Kathrada shared the same fate. The quarry became a clandestine parliament, the breaks, improvised classrooms. It was eventually called the University of Robben Island. In whispers, while the guards looked away, they debated politics. The echo of the peaks against the limestone of Robben Island had become the metronome of a suspended life. The African sun, relentless and white, bounced off the rock and blinded the men who broke it, reducing them to dark, sweaty silhouettes. There, in that purgatory of salt and dust, prisoner number 466-64 had learned to measure time not in days, but in the tides that lapped at the edges of his exile and in the slow wear of the stone beneath his hands. But the regime, in its arrogance, had made a fundamental mistake. They believed that by imprisoning the body, they also imprisoned the will. They did not understand that a cell can become a cloister, and a prison, a university. Within those grey walls, where the air smelled of sea and despair, Nelson Mandela and his companions initiated the most silent and profound of resistances. The quarry became an open-air classroom, and the cells, nighttime study halls. Men like Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Ahmed Kathrada, beacons of intellect and conviction, transformed the sentence into a perpetual seminar. They taught each other history, economics, literature, law. Each conversation, whispered far from the guards' ears, was an act of intellectual smuggling. Each shared idea was another brick in the construction of a nation that did not yet exist, a nation forged in the mind before it could be in the land. Mandela, with his almost monastic discipline, was the center of gravity of this prison universe. He rose with the first grey light filtering through the bars, his body hardened by forced labor, his mind sharpened by study. He read Shakespeare and Tolstoy, seeking in the universal human condition a reflection of his own struggle. He studied Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, not as an act of submission, but as a tool to understand the mentality of his jailers, to find the cracks in their armor of certainty. He was a general studying the map of enemy territory, even when the battlefield was his own soul and that of his captors. The resistance was not only intellectual, it was moral. It manifested in small acts of dignity that acquired immense resonance in that void. The struggle to obtain long trousers instead of the humiliating shorts reserved for black prisoners. The refusal to lower one's gaze. The polite yet firm treatment towards the guards. Time in the cell of Robben Island was measured in tides and in the slow growth of moss on stone. But outside its walls, the decade of 1980 arrived like a cold and violent wind, a wind that shook the very foundations of South Africa. The world, which had turned a blind eye for years, now watched with an uncomfortable intensity. The patience of nations had run out, turned to ash. The echo of Mandela's name, which had been a whisper within the prison walls and in the hearts of his people, now resonated in the parliaments of London and Washington, in concert stadiums and in student demonstrations around the globe. The campaign, Free Nelson Mandela, was no longer the plea of an oppressed people. It has become a moral imperative for a global generation. It was a simple song, a refrain that refused to die, and its melody began to erode the legitimacy of the Pretoria regime with the persistence of a drop of water on rock. In South Africa, the air had become thick, almost unbreathable. The government, led by the stern figure of P.W. Botha, the man known as the Great Crocodile, attempted a desperate maneuver. In an effort to calm the storm, he offered reforms that were little more than cosmetic cracks in a crumbling wall. He created a tricameral parliament, granting symbolic and powerless representation to mixed-race and Indian communities, while deliberately excluding the vast black majority. It was a miscalculation born of arrogance. Instead of dividing the oppressed, the measure unified them in their outrage. It demonstrated that the regime did not understand, or did not want to understand, that the demand was not for crumbs of power, but for the dignity of shared humanity. The response was swift. The townships, those vast belts of poverty surrounding the white cities, burned. It was not the fire of an organized revolution, but the spontaneous combustion of desperation. A new generation who had known nothing but apartheid, who could not remember a time before humiliation, rose up. They were the children and grandchildren of miners and maids, and their patience was shorter, their fury sharper. The streets filled with the acrid smell of burning rubber, the whistling of tear gas, and the dull roar of armored vehicles. The echo of the disturbances and the rising tide of international pressure had begun to erode the foundations of power. In the 1980s, the winter of apartheid, which seemed eternal, began to show cracks in its ice, fine fissures through which an uncertain light filtered, a possibility of thaw. The regime, a colossus of iron and dogma, remained standing, but its shrewdest leaders heard the creaking of the structure. They felt the tremor of the earth beneath their feet and knew that history, like a geological force, cannot be contained forever. At the heart of that forced stillness, in the solitude of his cell, a man had learned to measure time not in days, but in the erosion of stone and the patience of moss. Nelson Mandela was no longer the young lion of armed struggle. He was a patriarch forged in silence, a strategist whose mind had sharpened in the monotony of prison. His body was confined, but his mind was a map of possible futures, a living archive of the promise of a nation. And it was in that stillness where the most improbable seed germinated: dialogue. It all began not with a roar, but with a whisper. In 1985, after a prostate operation, Mandela was transferred to a hospital in Cape Town. There, in the sterile sterility of a white room, far from the dust and salt of Robben Island, he received a visitor. It was Kobi Coetzee, the Minister of Justice. He was not a blind ideologue, but a man of law, a pillar of the Afrikaner lineage who, however, understood that the future of his people could not be built on the ashes of another. It was a cautious meeting, a probing of two worlds that had communicated only through violence and silence. Those initial conversations were not negotiations, but something more fragile and fundamental, the act of recognizing the humanity of the other. They sat down, the prisoner and the jailer, and spoke. Not about surrender, but about the possibility of an end. The government, personified in the granite figure of P.W. Botha, the great crocodile, demanded that Mandela renounce violence. Mandela, with the calm of one who has weighed every word for more than 2 decades in the shadows, responded that it was the state that had initiated the violence. He offered no concessions, but a path. He explained with the patience of a teacher that peace could not be a condition for freedom, but its consequence. These meetings multiplied in absolute secrecy. The secret conversations, whispers in the corridors of power that had resonated like echoes in a cave for years, had finally woven a fragile yet tangible thread of hope. The long winter of apartheid, which had frozen the soul of South Africa for nearly half a century, was showing its first cracks, fissures through which an uncertain light seeped. The decision, announced by President F.W. de Klerk, a man of a lineage that had forged that system of stone and segregation, had fallen upon the country like unexpected rain after an endless drought. Nelson Mandela would be a free man. The air of that February in 1990 vibrated with palpable electricity, a mix of joy and fear. The 11th day dawned over Cape Town with a pale sun, as if nature itself held its breath. The entire world had its eyes fixed on the entrance of Victor Verster prison, a minimum security facility that had been the final resting place of the planet's most famous prisoner. It was no longer the grey walls and lime quarry of Robben Island, but a house with a garden, a more comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless, where the symbol had prepared to become a man again. Inside, a 71-year-old man was preparing to reunite with a world he barely remembered. 27 years, 6 months, and 6 days. A time so vast that it becomes a personal geology, with its own eras of erosion and sedimentation. It was not only the joy of freedom that surged within him, but also the overwhelming weight of a symbol. For nearly 3 decades, his absence had been a presence, more powerful than that of any man. His name, a banner, his face, a forbidden icon known to all. Now the myth had to regain flesh, bones, and a voice that was not an echo of the past. It is said that in those final hours, while the world waited, he maintained a solemn calm, the stillness of one who has learned to master inner time, to make it his ally and not his jailer. And then, the door opened. It was 4:15 on an afternoon that would be etched in the memory of the century. He did not run out, nor did he hurry like one fleeing. He walked, with the dignity of one who has measured time not in days, but in decades. By his side, Winnie, his wife, her hand firmly intertwined with his. The afternoon sun. The echo of the lock's opening had faded, replaced by the expectant murmur of millions of souls. Nelson Mandela, freed from the stone matrix of prison, was no longer walking through a prison yard, but through the vast and fractured landscape of a nation on the brink of its own rebirth or annihilation. South Africa, at the dawn of the 1990s, was a place of feverish beauty, suspended between euphoria and fear. The sunlight over the veld seemed brighter, but the shadows in the corners of the cities were deeper. The dense air of the townships vibrated with songs of freedom, while the tense silence of the white suburbs was populated with ancestral fears. The man who emerged from the stone was not an avenger forged in hatred, but a patient architect, with the fatigue of nearly 3 decades etched on the map of his face, yet with his gaze fixed on a horizon that only he seemed to see clearly. His task now was not to resist, but to build. And to build, he had to sit at the table with the guardians of the old order, those who had been his jailers. Before him, Frederick de Klerk, the last president of apartheid South Africa, a man who was dismantling, stone by stone, the edifice that his own lineage had constructed. He was not a convert moved by a moral epiphany, but a pragmatist who felt the tremor of the foundations, the inevitable creaking of a doomed structure. Thus began the negotiations, in rooms where the air was laden with the ghosts of a century. The Convention for a Democratic South Africa, known as CODESA, was not a simple political debate. It was a ritual of exorcism. Every word was a spade digging into the hardened soil of the past, seeking common ground to plant a seed. Mandela, with his almost supernatural calm, listened. He understood that peace was not imposed, it was negotiated. He spoke of a multiracial democracy, of a rainbow nation, not as a poetic dream, but as the only logical solution to an equation of hatred. De Klerk, for his part, fought to protect his people, to ensure that the end of his power did not mean the end of their existence. They were 2 men, aged by the weight of their peoples, trying to chart a map to escape a labyrinth they had not created, but had inherited. But the path was not a smooth trail under a benevolent sky. As word after the tense murmur of pacts and promises, after the crackling of the paper where the end of an era was signed, an expectant silence arrived. A silence that covered the plains of the Karoo and settled upon the peaks of the Drakensberg. It was the autumn of 1994 in South Africa, and the air, fresh and clear, seemed to hold the breath of an entire nation. The long night of apartheid had ended, but dawn arrived with the slowness of an uncertain tide, bringing with it both the light of hope and the shadow of fear of the unknown. The path to democracy, paved with blood, tears, and a will of iron, had reached its threshold. On the 27th of April, the day unfolded under a sky of almost painful clarity. From the early hours, before the sun warmed the earth, people began to walk. They did not march with the fury of protest, but with the solemnity of those approaching a sacred place. They formed lines that were not mere waiting queues. They were rivers of patience, human serpents winding through the dusty hills of the townships and the orderly sidewalks of the cities. Elders leaning on canes, with the memory of a century of humiliation etched on their faces. Young people who had never known anything but segregation, men and women of all races standing together, waiting. In those silent lines, time itself seemed to have stopped, suspended between an ash-laden past and a future that was still just a whisper. For millions, it was the first time their existence mattered, the first time their will would take shape on a piece of paper. In the hand of an elderly woman, the ballot was not just paper, it was the weight of a voiceless life. On the ink-stained thumb of a young man, there was not just ink, there was the promise of a future yet to be written. The sound of each vote falling into the ballot box was a soft echo, but it resonated with the strength of decades of struggle, with the memory of the fallen and the determination of the living. It was a silent revolution, carried out not with the clamour of steel, but with the quiet dignity of a people reclaiming their human lineage. Nelson Mandela, the man who had counted 27 years of his life by the passage of the sun in a stone cell, voted in Inanda, near the grave of John Dube, the first president of the African National Congress. The roar of history had been silenced. After the tide of votes and the euphoria of freedom, an expectant silence descended upon South Africa, dense as the morning fog that clings to the slopes of Table Mountain. The air no longer smelled of gunpowder or tear gas, but of wet earth after a long drought, of the promise of an uncertain harvest. Nelson Mandela, the prisoner turned president, no longer walked through the courtyard of a prison, but through the halls of power, the same halls that once housed the architects of his suffering. The weight he now felt on his shoulders was not that of chains, but of a lineage of pain and the hope of 40 million souls. At 75 years old, with the winter of Robben Island still in his bones, Mandela understood that the electoral victory was not an end, but a fragile beginning. A nation cannot be rebuilt with decrees, just as a broken stone cannot be mended by mere wishing. It requires patience, a steady pulse, and a glue stronger than hatred, reconciliation. This concept, so ethereal and elusive, became the cornerstone of his presidency. It was not a political strategy. It was a conviction forged in the solitude of the cell, a truth distilled drop by drop over 27 years of reflection. He knew that resentment was a poison that, sooner or later, would consume both the oppressed and the oppressor. His first act was a gesture of almost incomprehensible audacity. He formed a government of national unity, inviting his former adversaries, including F.W. de Klerk, to sit beside him. It was not an act of naivety, but of profound wisdom. He understood that white people, especially the Afrikaner community, lived in fear, the fear of retaliation, the echo of their own injustices. To build a future, he could not govern solely for the black majority that had elected him. He had to be the president of those who had imprisoned him, of their families, of their children. He had to teach them not to fear the night they themselves had created. But reconciliation could not live only in the halls of government. It had to descend to the streets, to the sports fields, to the kitchen table. And so, in 1995, the world witnessed one of the most powerful acts of healing in modern history. During the final of the Rugby World Cup, a sport that was the sacred symbol of Afrikaner pride, Mandela walked to the center of the field at Ellis Park Stadium. He wore the joy of 1994 had settled like fine dust after the passage of a caravan, revealing the cracked landscape that lay beneath. The Rainbow Nation was a promise, a dawn painted in the sky, but the land itself seemed to retain the memory of pain. In the farms of the veld, in the townships that clung to the cities like dark moss to stone, the past was not a ghost, it was a silent neighbor, an absence at the table, a scar beneath clothing. There were nameless crimes, disappearances without graves, whispered tortures in the stillness of the night. Mandela, the architect of the new era, understood with a clarity that chilled the soul that a nation cannot be built upon unmarked mass graves or on the silence of executioners. The path of conventional justice that of trials in the style of Nuremberg, would have ignited fragile peace, unleashing a civil war among those who still held weapons and economic power. The other path, that of forgetfulness, that of a general and blind amnesty, would have been a betrayal to every victim, a second death for those who had already perished. It was a choice between vengeance and amnesia, and neither offered a future. And so, from the mind of a statesman and the soul of a wounded people, an idea was born, as fragile as it was bold, a third path illuminated by a dim and terrible light: the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It were not a court to punish, but a forum to know. Its premise was an almost unbearable pact, a trade that defied the logic of pain: amnesty in exchange for truth. Perpetrators of serious human rights violations, whether state agents or members of liberation movements, could apply for amnesty if they confessed the entirety of their crimes. The amnesty was not forgiveness, which only the victims could grant. It is a legal act, a sacrifice on the altar of the future. At the forefront of this expedition into the heart of darkness stood a man whose laughter could fill a cathedral and whose tears could break stone: Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He would be the confessor of the nation, the custodian of its agony. The sessions began in 1996, not in grand marble courts, but in community halls, in red brick churches, under the functional light of softly buzzing fluorescents. There, horror shed its abstraction. Men who had been monsters in the shadows now sat before. The voices of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began to fade, leaving behind a dense silence, heavy with the weight of the stories told. The air of South Africa in the last years of the century was like that of a field after a long and brutal storm. The land was soaked with tears and blood. The scars were visible in every furrow. But the sun, a fragile and new sun, began to dry the mud. In this landscape of memory and hope, a man, whose name had become synonymous with the struggle itself, was preparing for a final act of leadership: the art of knowing when to withdraw. It was 1999. Nelson Mandela was 80 years old. In his face, every wrinkle was a reminder of a winter on Robben Island, every line around his eyes, the shadow of a loss or a victory won at an immense cost. He had guided his nation from the darkness of segregation to the threshold of a multiracial democracy. He had been the anchor in the tide of change, the shepherd who gathered a scattered and wounded flock. But the body, unlike the spirit, obeys the seasons. The fatigue was no longer that of a day's work, but of a lifetime spent on the front lines of history. A deep fatigue, woven into muscle and bone. His decision not to seek a second term was not a surprise, but its significance resonated with the force of an ancient gong. In a continent where power was often clung to with desperate hands until the last breath, Mandela offered a silent and profound lesson. Power, for him, was not a crown, but a tool that is used and then relinquished. It was the final piece of his democratic architecture, to demonstrate that the nation he had helped to birth could survive its founder. The man had to withdraw so that the institution could breathe on its own, so that the lineage of leadership would not depend on a single name, but on the will of the people. On the day of the transition in June, there was neither the pomp of a coronation nor the tragedy of an abdication. It was a solemn act, almost familial. The light of Pretoria fell upon the crowd as Thabo Mbeki, power like a tide, had receded from the shores of his official life. The roar of parliaments, the weight of the presidential seal, the constant murmur of advisors, all of it had faded into the still air of 1999, leaving behind a profound silence. But the silence surrounding Nelson Mandela was not empty. It was a resonant silence, laden with the echo of 27 years in a stone cell and 5 years at the helm of a wounded nation. It was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of his most fertile winter. A man of his lineage does not retreat into oblivion. He simply changes tools. He no longer wielded the pen that signed laws, but the moral authority that could move consciences. The world, as it entered a new millennium, was a tapestry of lights and shadows. Old hatreds burned in new fires, and a silent plague, a war without cannons or trenches, spread across continents, reaping lives with a cold indifference. It was HIV/AIDS. And it was on this global stage where Madiba's voice, now softer, more weary, but no less firm, found its new purpose. He was no longer the president of South Africa. He had become the grandfather of the world, a wise elder whose presence was enough to silence the clamour of the powerful and give voice to the suffering of the forgotten. His first battle was for peace, a cause he knew in the marrow of his bones. He travelled to Burundi, a land fractured by ethnic violence that was a bitter echo of the Rwandan nightmare. There, among armed men whose eyes still burned with the fire of conflict, Mandela did not arrive as a conqueror or as a judge. He came as a listener. He would sit, with the patience forged in the solitude of Robben Island, and listen for hours to the litany of grievances, the pain accumulated over generations. His mere presence was a reproach to violence. He did not shout. His voice was a whisper that pierced the armor of hatred, reminding the warring leaders that their peoples shared the same sun, the same rain, the same blood-stained land. He was a sower of pauses amidst the fury, and in those pauses, sometimes, the fragile seed of dialogue would germinate. Then there was education, the key that, according to him, had opened his own cell long before the guards did. He remembered the nights on the island, secretly studying, feeling how knowledge was an act of rebellion, a way to keep the spirit intact while the body withered. Now, with the prestige of his name, he travelled the world advocating not only for the building of schools, but the roar of the world, which for years had been the soundtrack of his life, was beginning to fade. It was no longer the clamour of the crowds in the stadiums, nor the persistent flash of cameras at the summits of power. It was, rather, the silence that follows a great storm, when the air is thick and every drop that falls from the leaves of the trees resonates with a profound clarity. Nelson Mandela, the man who had walked from a stone cell to the halls of the presidency, was now walking through the quieter corridors of his own sunset, and in that stillness, a question, as ancient as humanity itself, began to take shape in his mind. What remains when man is gone? What happens to the harvest when the sower is no longer there to watch over the fields? He had seen how the tides of history erode even the most solid monuments. He knew that the memory of a people is a fragile flame, susceptible to the winds of forgetfulness and the cold rain of indifference. A man, no matter how great his legend, was just that, a man. Flesh and bone, destined to return to the dust of the African land he loved so much. His struggle could not end with the last beat of his heart. The ideal of a just South Africa, of a world without chains, needed a more enduring home than his own body. It needed a house of stone and paper, of laws and lineage, where the echo of his voice could continue to resonate for generations yet to be born. Thus, in the winter of his life, Mandela became an architect, not of buildings, but of futures. He ceased to be the battering ram that broke down the walls of apartheid to become the stonemason who patiently and with a wisdom tinged with melancholy laid the first stones of its foundations. In 1999, the Nelson Mandela Foundation emerged. It was not a monument to himself, but a living archive, a center for dialogue, a place where the murmur of papers and the rigor of debate would keep the conversation about social justice alive. It was his beacon, built to guide other ships through the fogs of inequality, long after his own light had gone out. But his legacy could not be merely intellectual. It had to have the pulse of life itself. Thus, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund was born. And so, after having ignited fires in the hearts of millions, and having raised the foundations of a nation upon the ashes of hatred, the path of the fighter began to turn inward, toward the silence of his own sunsets. The echo of his words, which had torn down the walls of injustice, grew quieter, replaced by the whisper of the wind in the grasslands of Kunu, the home of his childhood, to which he always longed to return. The world, accustomed to his voice as a beacon in the storm, had to learn to navigate with the light of his memory. The 21st century found him as a patriarch, a wise elder whose body was beginning to feel the weight of nearly a century of battles. Each wrinkle on his face was a map of his journey, the severity of prison, the burden of the presidency, the smile of reconciliation. His retirement was not a door slammed shut, but a tide that slowly receded, leaving on the shore the indelible mark of its passage. He still received leaders and dignitaries, but his audiences became shorter, his presence more ethereal. He was no longer the strategist in the war room, but the grandfather of the nation, Madiba, whose simple gesture of approval or serene gaze was enough to guide. The land of South Africa, which he had helped to heal, offered him a final stage. It was in the winter of 2010, during the World Cup. The air of Johannesburg was icy, biting, but the Soccer City Stadium burned with a fever of unity and pride that he himself had sown. And then he appeared, fragile, bundled up to his eyes, traversing the field in a small vehicle. He did not deliver any speech. He did not need to. His mere presence, a trembling silhouette under the blinding lights, was a silent poem. The ovation that rose was not just for the man, but for the living history he embodied. It was a quiet farewell, a final blessing to his people gathered in celebration. After that night, the door closed a little more. His last years passed between his home in Johannesburg and the ancestral peace of Kunu. But the last years had been a slow farewell, a prolonged twilight in which the world watched, with a mix of gratitude and melancholy, as the light of one of its greatest figures dimmed. Time, which had sculpted his face with the patience of the tide upon the rock, began to claim its due. In the stillness of his home, far from the roar of stadiums and the corridors of power, Madiba lived in the echo of his own legend, a man whose physical presence faded while his spirit grew denser, more palpable in the fabric of the nation he had helped to birth. The air of South Africa seemed to hold its breath, awaiting news that everyone knew was inevitable, but that no one was prepared to hear. Finally, winter arrived at the house of Houghton. On the 5th of December 2013, in the serenity of the night, the final breath of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela dissolved into the air. It was not a thunderclap, but the cessation of a long and deep breath that had held the hope of millions. The man who had survived the rock and lime of Robben Island, who had bent the will of an iron regime, surrendered to the only power that does not allow negotiation. The fighter, the prisoner, the president, the father rested. The news spread not like a wildfire, but like a cold mist settling over the valleys at dawn. First in Johannesburg, then across the plains of Karoo to the coasts of the Cape, and finally crossing the oceans. In the streets of Soweto, the same ones that once burned with the fury of youth, people emerged from their homes. There were no disturbances, but songs, old struggle songs, hymns of freedom sung with a new and profound cadence of loss. It was a morning that felt like a debt of gratitude. They wept for the man, but celebrated the life he had given. The world came to a halt. Flags in distant capitals flew at half-mast. Leaders who in life represented opposing ideologies united in a chorus of reverence. From Washington to Havana, from London to Delhi, his name was spoken with a respect that transcended politics. It was the recognition that not only a statesman had died, but a moral compass for humanity. A man who demonstrated that forgiveness could be a more powerful tool than the sword. That reconciliation was not a sign. The thunder of tributes has faded. The world, after having wept and celebrated, has returned to its usual rhythm, to its tides of indifference and urgency. And in that silence that follows the storm, in the still air where speeches once resonated, is where the true legacy of a man begins to breathe. The flesh and blood man, Nelson Mandela, now rests in the red earth of Kunu, beneath the same vast sky that witnessed his birth. But his impact, like an echo in a deep valley, has only just begun its long journey through time. His name became a touchstone, a standard against which the world's conscience measures itself. In the halls of power, where diplomacy is often a game of shadows and mirrors, Mandela's figure stands tall like a pillar of granite. Leaders facing chasms of ancestral hatred, from the mists of Ireland to the jungles of Colombia, have looked to his path not as a magical solution, but as proof that the impossible sometimes has a door. Reconciliation, that word he filled with meaning through the weight of his own forgiveness, ceased to be a utopia and became a political strategy, an unwritten manual on how to rebuild a nation from its ashes without consuming the survivors in the fire of vengeance. But his deepest lineage does not reside in government palaces, but in the anonymous places where human dignity remains a daily battle. His story became a fire to which those feeling the chill of injustice gather. For the political prisoner counting the days in the dimness of a cell, the memory of Robben Island is a whisper of resistance. For the activist marching under an unrelenting sun, with a throat dry from cries for equality, Mandela's long road to freedom is the map that prevents them from losing themselves in despair. His life demonstrated a fundamental truth, as simple and as hard as stone, that an entire system of oppression can be dismantled by the persistence of human will. That 27 years of darkness cannot extinguish the light of an idea. His influence was woven into the very language of human rights. The number of his... And so, the bonfire consumes its last embers, and the long tale comes to an end. The smoke rises toward an indifferent sky, taking with it the dates, the battles, and the speeches. But what remains, suspended in the cold air of the night, is not ash. It is an echo, a residual warmth that clings to memory like moss to ancient stone. The man, Rolihlahla, no longer walks among us. His body has returned to the land of Kunu, to the same red earth he felt beneath his bare feet as a child. But his story has transcended flesh and bone. It has become a lineage, not of blood, but of spirit. The name Mandela no longer belongs to a man. It is a constellation in the moral firmament of humanity, a guide for lost navigators in the seas of injustice. His legacy is not a monument of granite, cold and perfect, to admire from a distance. It is rather a seed planted in the stony ground of human nature, watered for 27 winters with the patience of stone and the hope of the sun. Today, that seed germinates in unexpected places. It sprouts in the heart of a young activist who, in a distant square, raises a banner, not with anger, but with a defiant calm. It flourishes in the negotiation room where bitter enemies, exhausted by the sound of iron and the smell of gunpowder, decide to sit down and listen, remembering that a prisoner taught them to dialogue with their jailers. The true heritage of Mandela is not the rainbow South Africa, with its achievements and its persistent scars. That was his work, his canvas. His true legacy is an idea, as fragile and yet as resilient as life itself. The idea that reconciliation is not forgetting, but a higher form of memory. He taught us that forgiveness is not an act of divine holiness, but a deeply human decision, a strategic weapon against the endless cycle of revenge. It is the understanding that to build a future, one must not demolish the past, but face it head-on, with